You're sitting in a lab. A man in a white coat tells you to press a button. Every time the person in the next room gets an answer wrong, you press it, and they scream. Not just once, over and over, begging, pleading to stop, until one time, they go completely silent. You look at the man in the lab coat. He says, "Please continue." What do? Most of us think we'd stop. But in one of the most disturbing psychological experiments of all time, most people didn't. This is the true story of the Milgram experiment, an experiment so twisted, it changed the way we think about human nature, forever. It's the early 1960s. The world is still reeling from the nightmare of World War II. Millions dead, entire nations scarred, and one question keeps echoing through the rubble of history. How could so many ordinary people commit such unspeakable acts? Psychologist Stanley Milgram couldn't let it go. He wanted answers, not guesses, not opinions, real answers. So instead of asking people what they do under pressure, he tested them. His plan? Simple, diabolical. He would recruit everyday people, teachers, office workers, grocery clerks, tell them they were helping with a study on learning and memory. But that was a lie. What he was really testing was how far they'd go when ordered to hurt someone. What happened next would shock the world and change psychology forever. Milgram's experiment was deceptively simple, but psychologically intense. Volunteers, regular people off the street, were brought into a lab and told they'd be taking part in a study on learning and memory at Yale University. They were assigned the role of the teacher. Their job? Simple. Read word pairs to another person, the learner, and deliver an electric shock every time that person got an answer wrong. The learner was strapped into an adjacent room with electrodes attached. In front of the teacher sat a shock machine. Rows of switches labeled with increasing voltage, 15 volts, 75 volts, 150 volts, all the way up to 450 volts. The last ones were marked with big, bold warnings: danger, severe shock. And finally, just XXX. At first, it seemed harmless. The learner got a few answers wrong. The teacher flipped a switch and there was a quiet grunt from the other room. Nothing too serious, just part of the experiment. But then the voltage increased. The grunts turned to shouts, then to screams, then to something so agonizing the learner began begging for it to stop, maybe even crying out that he had a heart condition. The teacher, just an ordinary person, froze, confused, terrified, looking around the room like, is this really happening? Because on the other side of that wall, someone sounded like they were dying. And then, silence. No more screams, no more answers, just dead air. That's when the teacher would turn to the experimenter, this cold, expressionless man in a white lab coat, and say, "I think something's wrong." But the experimenter didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly said, "Please continue." The emotional toll was intense. Many teachers were visibly distressed. Milgram himself reported witnessing some participants breaking down with trembling, stuttering, and nervous laughter. One participant even had a seizure, but was encouraged to continue. Milgram's experiment wasn't just data on a clipboard. It was a live psychological pressure cooker, playing out in a cold, windowless lab where ordinary people were forced to confront the darkest parts of themselves. Behind the numbers were real stories, real breakdowns. One man, a middle-aged salesman, was calm when he walked in, polite, cooperative. But as the voltage climbed, so did his distress. He began sweating uncontrollably. His hands shook so badly he struggled to flip the switches. His voice cracked, his face twisted in anguish. And then, halfway through the session, he leaned forward and looked at the experimenter. His voice was barely a whisper. "I don't want to hurt him anymore. Please, can't we end this?" But the man in the lab coat didn't flinch. He simply replied, "The experiment requires that you continue." And with shaking hands, he pressed the highest voltage. Afterward, Milgram wrote that the man left the lab visibly shaken, as if carrying a heavy burden. Another participant reacted differently. As the learner screamed in agony, this man started laughing, not out of cruelty, not because he enjoyed it, but because he didn't know what else to do. It was a high-pitched, uneasy laugh, jarring against the sound of pain coming from the other room. He covered his mouth, apologized, but the laughter kept slipping out, like his mind was trying to escape the moment. Milgram later wrote that this kind of laughter wasn't joy, it was survival. A desperate coping mechanism when morality and obedience collided. These participants weren't heartless, they were human, and their reactions, whether trembling, pleading, or laughing, revealed something terrifying, that under pressure from authority, even good people can feel trapped and still follow orders. But perhaps the most disturbing moment was when one participant completely broke down. As the shocks escalated and the screams grew louder, this man, visibly overwhelmed, began to shake uncontrollably. Then, without warning, he collapsed into a full-blown seizure. His body convulsed violently, arms flailing, eyes wide with terror. It should have ended right there, but it didn't. Once the man regained some control, barely able to sit upright, the experimenter, stone-faced and clinical, simply said, "Please continue." And unbelievably, the test went on. This moment sent shockwaves through the scientific community. It was no longer just about shocking someone on the other side of a wall. The trauma was happening in real time, right in front of them. Milgram would later admit he hadn't fully grasped the emotional damage this experiment could cause. That seizure was his wake-up call. As the experiment wore on, something eerie began to surface. Participants, clearly disturbed by what they were doing, started saying the same kind of thing. "It's not me. It's the experimenter who's responsible." That one sentence said everything. It was a way to survive the moment, to hand off the guilt, the responsibility, the blame. They weren't monsters. They didn't want to hurt anyone. But in their minds, they weren't the ones doing the hurting. They were just following orders. And no story captured that inner war more vividly than one man's silent protest. He physically clung to the shock generator, wrapped his arms around it, refusing to press the button. His face was twisted in anguish, his entire body shaking as he fought back against the commands. He said no over and over, but the experimenter kept pushing, and finally, after what felt like forever, he gave in. Milgram later described this moment as a heartbreaking collision between conscience and control. The man wanted to stop, knew he should stop, but under relentless authority, even the strongest resistance began to crack. Sounds terrifying, right? It definitely was. But here's the twist. Thankfully, only one side of the experiment was real. What the teachers, the volunteers, didn't know was that the person screaming in the other room was just an actor. There were no electric shocks, no actual pain. But the setup? It was flawless. The shock machine looked real. The screams sounded real. The pleas for mercy, heartbreakingly real. To the teacher, every flick of the switch felt like they were torturing a living person. And that was the true horror. Because the pain they caused wasn't physical, it was psychological. And the scars? They were real. Milgram's results stunned the world. Roughly 65% of participants, nearly 2 out of 3, went all the way. They flipped the final switch, 450 volts, the highest possible shock. This after hearing blood-curdling screams, desperate pleas, and eventually, total silence. These weren't monsters. They weren't criminals or sadists. They were teachers, salesmen, secretaries, people who had walked in off the street. And yet, under the weight of authority, they became something else. After the experiment was made public, people were horrified, not just by the results, but by the methods. Was it ethical to put people through that kind of emotional torment, to deceive them so completely, to make them believe they were hurting someone, sometimes to the point of death? Critics called Milgram's work cruel, manipulative, a psychological trap. But others said it revealed something we couldn't afford to ignore, that under the right pressure, almost anyone could become an agent of harm. Milgram stood by his work. He claimed the trauma was short-lived and that the long-term insight was worth the cost. But the fallout from the study was massive. It sparked a global reckoning in the world of psychological research, leading to stricter ethical rules, new protections for participants, and one core requirement that hadn't existed before: informed consent. From then on, experiments would never be the same. But let's get to the biggest question still. Why did so many people obey? Why didn't they just walk away? Milgram believed the answer wasn't about cruelty. It was about structure, about how the situation was designed to trap people into obedience. First, the presence of authority. The experimenter wore a lab coat, spoke with confidence, and represented a respected institution. To the participants, he was the law. Second, the gradual escalation. The shocks didn't start at 450 volts. They started small, barely noticeable, just enough to make the next step feel manageable, like boiling a frog, 1 degree at a time. And third, the diffusion of responsibility. Over and over, participants said, "I didn't want to hurt him, but I thought the experimenter was in charge." Together, these elements formed a perfect storm, one that could override personal morals, common sense, even basic human empathy. And that's what made the Milgram experiment so terrifying. It didn't show us the worst kind of people. It showed us what any of us might do, under the right pressure. So what about you? Would you stop, or would you obey? The Milgram experiment isn't just history, it's a mirror, forcing us to confront our own limits of conscience and courage. If you found this story as unsettling and fascinating as I did, hit that subscribe button. We've got more true stories, chilling experiments, and dark moments from history that reveal just how far humans can go. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.